We are in week 3 of God on the Brain, where I'm hoping to demonstrate that the most important things to do with mental health, when understood from a theological perspective, are really not that complicated. Sorry? So we've doing a little bit of a sermon, looking at a scriptural approach to mental health. So in the first week, which you can see the symbols for on the slide there, we went through really a biblical understanding of the causes of human suffering and mental health problems in particular, looking mostly at the fall. So we had the broken relationship between God and humankind, illustrated by the expulsion from the Garden of Eden. We looked at the broken relationship between humans themselves in terms of Adam and Eve's relationship starting to break down and starting to blame one another for things that had gone wrong. There was a broken relationship between humankind and work, and the ground is cursed, and Adam's work is going to become difficult from that point on. We have a broken relationship between humankind and our environment. No longer do we enjoy the overabundance of Eden, which comes without effort. And childbirth, we're told, includes now pain in childbirth. So there's that broken relationship with our own nature and nature around us. And then lastly, there's a broken relationship with ourselves. Adam and Eve hide from God, realizing that they are naked, and shame, guilt, and all these negative emotions enter into human experience. If we can move on then. So this isn't last week because we had a break for Messy Church, but 2 weeks ago we turned things around and we thought about what is the biblical way of understanding things that would, in general terms, promote good mental health. And they're really the same things that promote human thriving in general. And the two big biblical lenses on that are the concept of blessing, which is your symbol on the right there, and we looked at some of the covenantal blessings and how that involved fruitfulness and regular rain that comes from the sky and helps you grow your food, and all those sorts of things relating to the parts of the fall that were to do with occupation and material needs. We also looked at the biblical concept of peace, or shalom. And again, how that, in particular, we looked at how that is expressed through the Prince of Peace and his reign. And we had started to scratch the surface of how, in the world in which we live, there are inevitably going to be difficult conflicts and compromises when trying to reach that peace, and we need to pray for discernment and wisdom. There can be situations where because of the conflicting views and interests of people involved, there can be no one solution which everybody would view as peaceful. And when it comes to ourselves, we can wish very hard to have peaceful thoughts, but we don't always have them, and if we simply reject them out of hand, we're never going to be able to work on them. So we need to acknowledge those parts of ourselves we might rather not be there, and invite God into helping us change them gradually over time as part of our Christian walk. So this week we are going to move on to God's response to his people in distress. Now again, the Bible doesn't have the same modern concept of mental illness, as it were, so these are not going to be sort of necessarily mental illness examples exactly, but we're going to hopefully draw some wisdom, some principles from them to inform how we might respond when people come to us, either in a church or personal capacity, with mental health struggles of different kinds. First, though, we're going to take a little diversion via Job and have a think about what not to do. So this is Eliphaz the Temanite. What's a Temanite? We don't know, because the book of Job is one of the few books of the Bible which is written totally in the abstract, outside of any sort of historical grounding. Job himself is from the land of Uz, but there's no other reference to the land of Uz. We have no idea where the land of Uz might have been, or if it ever even existed, or whether it is purely allegorical. So, by this point in the story, Job's life has gone terribly, terribly wrong. His children have died, his crops have failed, his barns have burned down. All these various things have afflicted him, and unsurprisingly, he's feeling pretty bad about it. And this is Eliphaz, one of Job's so-called friends or comforters, who, of course, we learn through Job, are really pretty much the opposite of comforters. And we have a little excerpt here. So Eliphaz is saying, is it for your piety that he rebukes you or brings charges against you? Is not your wickedness great? Are not your sins endless? You demanded security from your relatives for no reason. You stripped people of their clothing, leaving them naked. You gave no water to the weary. You withheld food from the hungry. And if we move on. Though you were a powerful man, owning land, an honoured man living on it, and you sent widows away empty-handed and broke the strength of the fatherless. That is why snares are all around you, why sudden peril terrifies you, why it is so dark you cannot see, why a flood of water covers you. So Eliphaz here does not that bad a description of what it can feel like to have mental illnesses. It can feel like you are drowning and like you are being covered in water. It can feel like there is no future ahead of you and you can feel terrified by everything going on around you. But what Eliphaz has done is jump to the conclusion based on a certain logic that God is just and therefore if bad things are happening to you, it must be just. And therefore you must therefore have done something terrible. We know, of course, because Job is written from an omniscient narrator perspective, that Job has done none of these things. In fact, he's picked out of all the people on the earth as God's example of one of the most righteous men alive. He hasn't done any of this, but there is this assumption that if bad things are happening to you, you must be a bad person. And this was not at all uncommon in the historical context. Every society and culture has had some way of appeasing the gods should you suffer misfortune. When Jesus was around, people went to temples of Asclepius, who I'm fond of amongst the Roman gods, because his staff is still the symbol of medicine, the one with a twisty snake going around it. And you would go to the temple and you would have potentially some hallucinogenics, and then you'd have dreams, and you'd interpret the dreams, which would tell you which god you had offended, and therefore which other temple you needed to go offer some sacrifices at. That was sort of their interpretation. You must have done something to offend the gods if things are going wrong in your life, and therefore you need to go make the corrective sacrifices. This day and age, you don't tend to get that diagnosis quite so much. I suppose sort of the closest thing that I certainly hear all the time is that it's not so much that you've offended against God and you've committed a terrible sin, it is that you haven't been true to yourself, and that if only you will be truer to yourself in some way, shape or form, then your problems will get better. But that's not necessarily any more of a helpful diagnosis, which we will come to. Just to quickly touch on the fact that, try and be 100% clear, from a biblical point of view, and certainly from Jesus' point of view, grave misfortune is not an indication of sin. Eliphaz's diagnosis here is wrong, so we see that most clearly when Jesus is asked about, or mentions the Tower of Siloam. If you remember that story where Jesus talks about, what about the people who this big tower fell on? Were there any greater sinners? And his answer is no, they weren't any greater sinners than anybody else. So personal misfortune can be a natural consequence of certain things that we do, but it is not a direct and divine punishment for sin. If we can move on. So Eliphaz has a very straightforward diagnosis that you have sinned, that you are in some way a bad and terrible person. Actually going to hop back ever so slightly, because it can be easy to think of Eliphaz as sort of, obviously wrong and foolish in some ways. Easy to, but actually, I think, just a bit of sympathy for Eliphaz for a moment. He has something of a right to be sceptical. I think, I have certainly in my professional work as a psychiatrist had plenty of patients who have sworn to me they wouldn't say boo to a goose, even though they know that I know their forensic history and all the various crimes that they've committed. And they say, no, doctor, I wouldn't harm a fly. And it's like, well, you've harmed quite a lot of people, let alone flies. And they know I know that, but they will still say it sometimes. So, we all have encountered people who would not necessarily be straightforward with us. And this jumping to conclusions thing, again, is a very natural human instinct. So to just a little bit of sympathy for others, we see that all the time, don't we? Again, in the public sphere, perhaps most obviously, people will hear a couple of facts about some random celebrity drama, and they'll jump to, incredible conclusions about that person's deep psychology that has led to this one random thing they've read in a magazine article and that sort of thing. With Donald Trump, the American Psychiatric Association had to repeatedly write to their membership telling people not to go on live air psychoanalyzing Donald Trump repeatedly because they weren't his doctor. And although there, are some personality flaws which are on display, they were not, at liberty to jump to conclusions when they didn't know any of the details of his personal life and didn't know him personally. So, before we move on, a little bit of sympathy for that perspective and to acknowledge again that tendency to link when bad things have happened to people that they must in some way be a bad person. That is a very natural assumption to make that we should all try and be aware of. Anyway, we move on to Job. So Eliphaz has this relatively sort of easy diagnosis, and he comes up with a fairly easy prescription for it. Submit to God and be at peace with him. In this way, prosperity will come to you. Accept instruction from his mouth. Lay up his words in your heart. If you return to the Almighty, you will be restored. If you remove wickedness far from your tent and assign your nuggets to the dust, your gold of Ophir to the rocks in the ravines, then the Almighty will be your God, the choicest silver for you. Surely then you will find delight in the Almighty and will lift up your face to God. You will pray to him and he will hear you. You will fulfill your vows. So this easy prescription of bad things must be happening in your life because you're a bad person comes with this very easy diagnosis, comes with an easy prescription of just get close with God and your problems will all get better. Which, again, not the worst idea. I'm not going to say that getting closer to God or trying to get close to God when somebody is suffering with mental illness is a bad decision to make. It's definitely the right decision, but it is certainly not so simple as to say just turn back to God and then everything will be fine, which is more or less what Eliphaz is saying here. It takes time, it takes complexity, and if we come in with that sort of easy prescription, then it's going to leave people feeling really bad when they just try it, like try praying harder or something, and things don't necessarily inevitably get better. So we're talking about what not to do. And so Eliphaz has come in, been very judgmental, and it's tempting, sort of, society tells us a lot to be non-judgmental. And again, that's not intrinsically a bad thing, right? But I think from a biblical point of view, it doesn't really quite get the nuance right. So I'm just going to put a bit of a pin in that. So coming in with loads of judgment when someone's coming to you with emotional or behavioural problems is very unlikely to help, and they're very unlikely to come back to you with these problems in the future if that's how you respond. But being non-judgmental in and of itself doesn't quite get us far enough from a biblical perspective. Just like saying, well, turn back to God doesn't quite get us all the way there. It is a good step in the right direction, but it is not all that we can do for people. And it requires further steps. So, we've got what not to do illustrated by that. So he comes in, very judgmental and oversimplifies things, and then comes up with an oversimplified prescription and no real practical assistance. At this point, I sort of have then made choices of which examples of God's response to his people's distress to choose. So be aware from here on in that it's very selectively chosen, and feel free to pick me up on that later if you think I've chosen incorrectly. And we are certainly being illustrative and not exhaustive. There are many other such examples from Scripture that we could have chosen and learnt a lot from. So, in terms of what to do, so we've got what not to do, which is being very judgmental and being overly simple in our remedies. We're going to go to Ruth. So Ruth here, both Naomi and Ruth are working on the basis that this is probably a fairly familiar story to most of you. They're both bereaved, and I'm not saying bereavement is a mental health problem, but there is still wisdom here. So, may the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband. And she kissed them goodbye, and they wept aloud and said to her, we will go back to you with your people. But Naomi said, return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband, even if I thought there was still hope for me. Even if I had a husband tonight and gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters, it is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has turned against me. At this they wept aloud. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. Look, said Naomi, your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her. But Ruth replied, don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my God, and your God, my God. So, again, not to say bereavement is a mental health problem. It is part of life's rich tapestry that we must all go through at some point. We see that Naomi is feeling bitter, resentful. She feels God has turned against her. Naomi's response to that is not with a theological lesson about how God hasn't turned against you. You know, this stuff just happens and it's really, really sad. It is to commit to be there for her. Now, it is a very radical commitment to leave your entire country to go with someone, some place you don't know, might not necessarily speak the language. Got to navigate a whole new social milieu. There's no social security nets or anything to keep you safe. She's leaving everything she knows because of her commitment to her mother-in-law. And again, as I said at the start, this is intended partly to show that this stuff is not complicated, this stuff is not rocket science, but one of the most important things we can do when people are suffering with mental illness is to commit to be there for them. We don't necessarily have to commit to leave our country and live with them, but what commitment we can make to walking alongside them, and we need to try our best to be consistent in that commitment and to see it through as far as we can. So that's where we're going to start. We're going to do a few, so we're not going to linger too long on any one example, but we have with Ruth, commitment, be there for people, walk alongside them through their suffering. We move to Kings 19. So this is the bit in the story where we've just had the Elijah and the prophets of Baal, and they've done the whole thing where they were self-harming and dancing around a sacrificial altar, and nothing happened, and then the fire came down from heaven, burnt up all the altar and all the water and everything, and all the prophets of Baal got executed. And then so Elijah's presumably feeling pretty good at that exact moment in time, and then we start the story at the moment where he comes bump straight back down to earth off of that high. Now Ahab told Jezebel everything Elijah had done and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. So Jezebel sent a message to Elijah to say, may the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like that of one of them. Elijah was afraid, understandably, and ran for his life. When he came to Beersheba in Judah, he left his servant there, while he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness. He came to a broom bush, presumably a particularly bushy type of bush, sat down under it and prayed that he might die, it should say, I hope. Then he lay down under the bush and fell asleep. All at once, an angel touched him and said, get up and eat. He looked around, there by his head was some bread baked over hot coals, a jar of water. He ate and drank and lay down again. The angel of the Lord came back a second time and touched him and said, get up and eat, for the journey is too much for you. So he got up, ate and drank. Strengthened by that food, he travelled 40 days and 40 nights until he reached Horeb, the mountain of God. There he went into a cave and spent all the night. So we have Elijah here. The 40 days, 40 nights rabbit hole, we're not going to go down. Interesting, but probably for another time. What I'm drawing your attention to here is this, because this is one of my favourite bits of the Bible, where Elijah's going, just kill me, I give up, and God's like, just have a snack, have a nap, you'll feel a lot better, and then come and talk to me. And that is God's basic response here. So, again, very simple wisdom here. If people are coming to us and they're in that, was Elijah really suicidal, or was he just kind of being hyperbolic? We don't really know exactly. But he's certainly under a lot of stress, and just like, I've just done this amazing sort of miracle, this whole sort of battle with these other priests, which I won, but it hasn't changed anything. And he just cannot see how things are going to turn around. He has given up on the northern kingdom of Israel totally. And for him, that's his whole mission, right? He's a prophet. He's there to preach the word of God to people, and he just cannot see a way forward. God's initial response is not, again, no theology lesson for him here. Just, have a rest, have some food, and then we can talk. And so meeting people's basic needs, showing people concern, care, hospitality when people are suffering with all sorts of different mental health problems. Simple acts like preparing a meal for someone can communicate concern for them, acceptance of them, welcome to them in ways that people can find very hard to register with words. So simple acts of hospitality are very, very valuable. The other thing is, of course, that if people's basic material needs aren't met, they're not going to be able to do the stuff that they need to get better. So if people are, not eating, not sleeping, not drinking, then their physical health's going to deteriorate. Their mental state isn't really going to improve in that physical situation. So you're going to need to address them first from a basic point of view anyway. Everything is harder when you haven't had a good sleep and when you're hungry. So you've got to meet those basic needs before you get on to the slightly more complex areas. All right, we move on. Staying with the same story this time. The Lord appears to Elijah. The word of the Lord came to him. So, what are you doing here, Elijah? He replied, I've been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, thrown down your altars, put your prophets to death with the sword. I am the only one left, and now they are trying to kill me too. The Lord said, go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by. That a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart, shattered the rocks before the Lord, but the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came a gentle whisper. When Elijah heard it, he pulled his cloak over his face, went out and stood at the mouth of the cave. Then a voice said to him, what are you doing here, Elijah? He replied, I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, put your prophets to death with the sword. I am the only one left, and now they are trying to kill me too. The Lord said to him, go back the way you came, go to the desert of Damascus. Where you get there, anoint Hazael king over Aram. Oh, did I leave the verses there? Well, slight mistake on my point on the PowerPoint editing. There is the bit where he then goes and tells him to anoint Elisha, and there is a remnant preserved of the faithful as well. So, we have here this whole spectacular thing which demonstrates God's power and authority and recalls us back in the story to the other times where we've been up this mountain with Moses, going up and back and forth multiple times, receiving the 10 Commandments, smashing the 10 Commandments, going back up, getting the 10 Commandments again, and coming down again. So this is dialing us into all of those past stories. But again, not a rabbit hole we're going to spend any time going down today. What we are going to draw your attention to is the fact that God is talking to Elijah in the gentle whisper, not in the fire, not in the earthquake, not in these big shows of power. He's not just giving him a big ticking off. Elijah is covering his face because of potentially dying if he sees God. But it's in the gentle whisper that God is talking to him. So, again, simple wisdom. How does God respond when his people are in distress, when his sort of main man, as it were, at this point in the story, cannot see a way to go on? He talks to him in a gentle whisper. And what does he talk to him about? We get the start of it there. Again, sorry for the editing. But he orientates him away from the problem and towards the solution. Elijah has given up. He cannot see a way out of his difficulties. And God just gently says, you know what? You can't see a way out of it, but there are some things we can do. We can go anoint a new king. We can go get Elisha to come help you with your work. We can find you a community of faithful believers that still exists to be around you, to support you, protect you, potentially, if the armed guards are coming after you to try and stab you to death. So God is gently reorientating Elijah away from the problem towards the solution. I know that's a terrible cliche, but of the cliches that are out there, it is one that contains some useful wisdom. There is a time for just talking things out and doing those sort of longer sorts of talking therapies and just spending time with people. And it can be a tricky balance to find between doing the talking bit and doing the action bit. you need to have an established relationship before people are going to start listening to your advice and taking things on board and maybe considering, suggestions that you might come with for problems they perhaps haven't been able to find a solution for themselves. But a lot of what can be done and what will help certainly for the more common mental illnesses like anxiety and depression and so on, is you've got to do at some point. You've got to change the way you're acting and doing things. And cognitive behavioural therapy, which is the commonest type of therapy you're likely to get, certainly in the UK, but probably around the world, most of the world as well. That behavioural bit is about identifying how to get people to incrementally start doing the stuff that they're not doing, help them bit by bit to get out of whichever rut it is they found themselves stuck in that's led to the difficulties they're facing. And so that is also part of God's wisdom here with Elijah, is gently, like gentle whisper, saying, these are the ways we're going to solve the problem. It's a practical approach to dealing with the very real and significant concerns he had. Okay, let's move on again. So, again, famous bit here. I'm not telling you, reading bits, anything exactly new and groundbreaking. We have John. At dawn it appeared again at the temple courts where all the people were gathered around him, and he sat down to teach them. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought in a woman caught in adultery. They made her stand before the group and said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. In the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now what do you say?" They were using this question as a trap in order to have a basis for accusing him. Jesus bent down and started to write on the ground with his finger. Fairly lateral move from Jesus at this point, I think. When they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, "Let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." Again, he stopped down and wrote on the ground. At this, those who heard began to go away one at a time, the old ones first, until only Jesus was left with the woman still standing there. Jesus straightened up and asked her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" "No one, sir," she said. "Then neither do I condemn you," Jesus declared. "Go now and leave your life of sin." So, Jesus showing patience here, gentleness. He's just, writing on the ground. What he's writing, we don't know. Could have been anything. But he's patient. He just waits for the people to ask their questions, thinks about it, answers, then just waits as they go on their way. It's patient. It's gentle. It's accepting of the woman. And this is where I feel like the sort of non-judgmental doesn't quite capture things. It's too often used as a way to skirt responsibility, to avoid doing anything we might find difficult, or just to engage in a superficial relationship with someone. If our standard is, well, I just have to be not judgmental and that's what makes me a good person, then the easiest way to do that is actually just to have superficial relationships with people, because if you actually get to know them, you might start thinking judgmental things about them. So if you just keep everybody at a sort of an arm's distance, then you can, easier to be not so judgmental. I really spent quite a while trying to get the language right, and I still don't think I've got it quite right. So if you have any suggestions, then feel free to let me know. Leanna helped me out with this, and she's not here today because unfortunately Tess is sick, but we sort of felt the best way we could encapsulate is that he is accepting but not permissive. He's quite direct. Go and leave your life of sin. He's not beating around the bush. He is calling her to action, calling her back to her marriage. And again, we don't know anything about her marriage, but in a general sense, calling someone back to re-engage with their marriage, it's what's life-giving, it's what brings lasting joy, it's what brings happiness and purpose. And so he's calling her back. He's not coming in with a load of judgment, very much the opposite, but nor does he shy away from trying to bring her back to the path that she should be on. So as I say, the best way we could try and encapsulate that is accepting, but not permissive. And I think that can be, in practice, it sounds very simple, but can be in practicality very difficult to know exactly how to judge it. But I think that should generally be the shape of how we try and respond, because we don't want fear of coming across as judgmental to mean that people get allowed to continue in harmful patterns of relating to people, harmful patterns of behaviour. There comes a point where people do need the direction to get back on the right track. But if that is coming from a place of severe judgment, they're not going to receive it. If it's coming from a place of acceptance and love and concern for that person to get back on the right track, to get doing those things which are lastingly going to lead to, in a mental health context, recovery, or in a general life sense, sort of joy and happiness, then that is what we should do. And we see that developed and expounded in a lot of ways through Paul's writing. Paul's writes a lot about love and joy, gentleness, humility. But if there are situations in his letters where people are just persistently causing real damage and division, he's like, I'm sorry, but you have to put those people to one side. It's a last resort, but you have to be able to do it at some point. But our starting point should be that love, gentleness, sort of Galatians 5, fruit of the Spirit stuff that we need to all be working on in our walks. So, if we can perhaps hop onto the last slide. Today, hopefully, chosen some illustrative examples. As I said earlier, definitely not exhaustive. But just to recap today, we've had that sense of commitment between Ruth and Naomi, particularly from Ruth to Naomi, to walk with her, to give that consistent support, to be with her through her struggles. We have God first meeting with Elijah, where he just meets his basic needs, just gets him in that right place, shows some hospitality, shows care and concern through meeting those basic needs. He then talks to him, and he talks to him in a gentle whisper, with kindness, with care, working together on the solutions rather than sort of getting stuck and fixated on the problems. And then Jesus shows us, for his example with the woman caught in adultery, how we can be accepting of people, but not permissive of, destructive acts. And yes, difficult balance to find, but one that we should be trying to strike if we can. So, thank you all for listening again this afternoon. Next week is going to be totally different, because we're going to, having said that the majority of the way to biblically approach mental illness is fairly sort of straightforward and general in terms of expression of Christian works and values and ethos. There are specific things you can do as well, so we're going to give some of that a try, which some of you might like and some of you might hate, because we're going to do some contemplative practices and some Christian mindfulness. So we'll see how that goes next time around. Thank you all.